She observed him lying there, blissfully unaware, the steady rise and fall of his chest so calm, so innocent. It was a stark contrast to the chaos swirling in her mind. His peaceful breathing made the storm inside her seem even more violent. He had no clue, no idea about the tempest brewing within her. It wasn't just boredom. No, it ran much deeper. The tight dress that clung to her curves in all the right places was evidence enough she wasn't dressing for him anymore. As she adjusted it in the mirror, her lips curled into a smirk. Tonight was about something else, something darker, something more thrilling. Oh, don't think for a second she didn't hesitate. That trembling hand on the door, classic. For a fleeting moment, she almost turned back, but she didn't. She was too far gone. The rush of betrayal, the pull of stepping into the unknown, thrummed through her veins as her heart raced. She stepped out, letting the night consume her. There was no turning back now. The streets were quiet, as if the world itself held its breath, waiting for her next move. She passed by those perfectly ordinary homes, everyone inside probably fast asleep, living their simple lives. If only they knew. Her heels clicked against the pavement, each step a beat in the symphony of her twisted desires. Excitement surged within her, but guilt, oh yes, guilt, crept in too. But not enough to stop her. And then, there he was, the first one, leaning against a bar's entrance, a cigarette dangling from his lips, his eyes sweeping over her in a way that made her pulse quicken. He didn't need to ask her intentions, they were written all over her. She felt her throat tighten, nerves mixing with the thrill of what was about to unfold, but she didn't hesitate, not anymore. She led him silently behind the bar, into the filthy alley where the night seemed its darkest. His hands were on her immediately, rough, demanding, and she let him. The adrenaline rush was intoxicating, like a drug she couldn't resist. The alley reeked of garbage, the cold metal of a dumpster pressed into her back, but none of it mattered. It was the anonymity, the complete detachment from her real life, that gave her a twisted sense of control. His hands tore at her dress, and she gasped, but her face remained neutral. Her mind was far away from the reality of it all. It ended as quickly as it had begun, no tenderness, no affection, just raw, unfiltered lust. He didn't say a word, didn't even look back as he walked away, leaving her breathless and disheveled. Her dress hung in tatters from her shoulders, her legs shaky as she tried to compose herself. Yet, as she stood there, fixing her dress as best she could, she wasn't done, not by a long shot. She crossed the street, her heart pounding with a mix of shame and excitement. Her wild eyes scanned the darkness, searching for her next encounter, hungry for it. Then she saw them, a group of men. Their eyes locked on her instantly, predatory. It was a rush, the fear and exhilaration blending in a way that made her knees weak. She knew what they wanted, and God help her, she wanted it too. No words were needed. She led them, without hesitation, into a side alley. They followed, their footsteps heavy, anticipation thick in the air. No questions were asked, no pleasantries exchanged. They didn't need them. When she closed her eyes, the world faded to black. All that existed was the sensation, the feeling of being taken, bodies pressed against hers, hands everywhere, mouths claiming her without mercy. There was no room for thought, no space for anything but sensation. She gave in completely, drowning in the darkness, the anonymity her only solace. As they took turns, one after another claiming her, she became further detached from the woman she had been just hours ago. She was no longer the wife her husband knew. She had become something else, something darker, something thrilling, something broken. There was barely time to breathe before the next man took his turn. Their hands were everywhere, rough and impatient, pulling her in every direction like she was a rag doll. But she wasn't resisting. No, she was deep in it now, lost in the thrill. Her eyes glazed over, her mind disassociated from her body. She was gone, the only thing anchoring her to reality being the pulse of adrenaline surging through her veins. It was chaos, bodies pressed against her, mouths on her skin, fingers and hands fighting for space as if she was something to be devoured. You could almost sense her confusion, the excitement mingling with disgust, her mind betraying any better judgment she once had. But what judgment? She had left that behind the moment she stepped out of her house, hadn't she? It was the anonymity she craved, and now she was drowning in it. Here's where it got even more twisted. One of them pulled out a phone. He stood just far enough back to capture the scene, recording the act without her noticing. Or maybe she did notice, but by then, she was too far gone to care. She didn't stop them, didn't protest, just let them take what they wanted. It wasn't just her body betraying her, it was her silence, her complicity in the filthy affair. She gave them everything, and they took it, no hesitation. When it finally ended, when the last one finished and they scattered like wolves leaving their prey, she stumbled, literally stumbled, her legs weak, her body aching, her mind just beginning to catch up with the weight of what she had done. But it didn't stop her. Instead of going home, locking the door, and pretending none of it had happened, she kept wandering the streets, her torn clothes hanging off her hair a mess, hungry for more. Because, once you've started down this path, where's the limit? She found him at a bus stop, just sitting there like he had been waiting for her. His eyes followed her, curiosity mixed with something darker. She didn't need to say a word. You can almost picture it, her standing there, her torn dress clinging to her body, and him realizing exactly what she was offering. Without a second thought, she led him behind a row of parked cars. This one was rough too, maybe rougher. Bruises bloomed on her skin where his hands gripped too tight, but she barely felt it. She was numb, disconnected from her body, watching herself from the outside as he took what he wanted. When it was over, she was left there again, marked, used, but somehow, satisfied. By the time she decided to go home, the sun was already beginning to rise. The streets were quiet again, as if the night had never happened. But her body told a different story, bruises, torn clothes, her skin raw from the hands that had claimed her. And yet, there was an odd sense of satisfaction bubbling up inside her. Not happiness, not really, something darker, something twisted. The satisfaction of knowing she had crossed a line she could never uncross. As she unlocked the front door, dread settled over her like a heavy blanket. What if he was awake? What if he knew? But when she stepped inside, the house was still. Her husband was still asleep, completely unaware of the betrayal that had unfolded in the streets just hours ago. Relief washed over her, but it was fleeting, like a moment of calm before a storm. She slipped into bed beside him, her heart racing. He stirred in his sleep, reaching for her, pulling her close as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. She could feel the guilt rising, suffocating her, like a wave threatening to pull her under. Yet she didn't pull away. She let him hold her, feeling the sharp contrast between his innocent touch and the rough hands that had gripped her all night. The next morning was even worse. She couldn't look him in the eye, couldn't stand to meet his gaze. Every time he spoke, she felt like he was looking right through her, seeing the shame etched into her skin. She made excuses, kept herself busy, anything to avoid facing the truth. But it didn't matter. Her mind replayed every detail from the night before, the men, the bruises, the video she never saw. And as the guilt gnawed at her, a sick sense of triumph bubbled up alongside it. She had gotten away with it, hadn't she? For now. But the weight of what she had done, the lies, the betrayal, it was only just beginning. She tried to pretend things were normal in the days that followed. She played the part of the doting wife, smiled, and nodded. But oh, if you could see behind that mask. She couldn't stand his touch anymore. Every time her husband reached for her, it felt like fire on her skin, burning her with the memory of everything she had done. His affection, once something she craved, now twisted the knife deeper. A painful reminder of her betrayal. She made excuses, of course, always a reason to leave the house, to avoid intimacy, to escape. But nighttime has a way of exposing the truth. Lying there in the dark, her eyes wide open, she couldn't shake the images from her mind. The alley. The hands. The bruises. Everything replayed in slow motion, disgust mixed with an odd sense of empowerment. She hated herself for what she had done, but the power she had felt in those moments, that was something she couldn't deny. It crept under her skin, keeping her awake. Her body still buzzing from the thrill of being used, she couldn't escape it, even if she tried. Of course, she went back, how could she not? The bar where it all began pulled her in like a magnet. She needed that feeling again, the rush, the danger. But this time, things were different. The fear that someone might recognize her wouldn't go away. Her heart raced as she scanned the streets for familiar faces, but her paranoia was deafening. She left before anything could happen, feeling the weight of disappointment claw at her. Her husband wasn't a fool. He noticed the late-night walks, the quiet dinners, her sudden reluctance to be touched. She used to cling to him, but now she treated him like a disease. His eyes tracked her more closely now, his questions circling around the things she wasn't ready to answer. He knew something was wrong, you could feel the tension in the air, thick like smoke. But she wasn't ready to watch it all fall apart, not yet. Panic set in as she started wiping her phone, deleting every trace of her secret life, no messages, no numbers, nothing. She cleaned it all, thinking she could erase her sins before he found them. But we all know that doesn't work, don't we? Then came the message. It was late at night, her husband in the shower, when her phone buzzed with a notification from an unknown number. She opened it, and there it was. The video. Her video. The encounter with the group of men, every shameful detail recorded. Her body, exposed like she was nothing but a plaything. Her breath caught as panic surged through her, frantically trying to delete it. But the damage was already done. Whoever sent it had more, they had everything. And with a single click, they could destroy her. It didn't take long for the cryptic messages to start, like a cat playing with its prey. But the demands soon followed: money, or worse, the threat of sending the video to her husband. Her world unraveled before her eyes, and she was powerless to stop it. She agreed to meet him, of course. What choice did she have? She couldn't let her husband see that video, couldn't let her life implode like that. So, she met the man in a dingy back alley, hoping to settle it quietly, maybe by his silence. But when she arrived, his intentions were clear: money wasn't enough. He wanted her again. You could see the fear and resignation on her face. She didn't want this, not now, not like this. But she had no choice. She let him take control, pulling her back into the darkness, knowing this was just the beginning of a nightmare she could never escape. The blackmail didn't stop, of course. It only got worse. He wanted more encounters, more control, as if her life had become his playground. Each time they met, something inside her broke a little more. She walked into those meetings hollow, knowing she'd leave even more shattered than before. But what choice did she have? The shame of each encounter clung to her like a shadow. The feeling of being used, again and again, dragged her deeper into the pit she'd created for herself. Her husband noticed the bruises, how could he not? She couldn't hide them all. And the distance she kept from him, it was obvious. She wasn't just avoiding his touch anymore, she was avoiding him completely. When she wasn't avoiding him, she overcompensated, trying too hard to act normal, too many fake smiles, too much careful conversation. And you know what happens when you try too hard, people notice. He did what any suspicious husband would do, he started looking into things. Not asking her directly, of course, he was too smart for that. No, he quietly began digging, piecing together the puzzle she thought she'd hidden so well. Then it happened. One night, after yet another degrading encounter, she came home to find him waiting. There was something about the way he sat in the dim light of the living room that made her heart sink. He was silent, his face unreadable. But it was the laptop on the coffee table that sent chills down her spine. She knew what it meant before he even said a word. He didn't have to. He opened the laptop, pressed play, and there it was, the video. The one she thought she could keep hidden. The one that exposed everything in brutal detail. She stood frozen as her world collapsed, every degrading moment, every shameful second of her betrayal playing out right in front of him. There was no way to hide it anymore. It was all out in the open. She tried to explain, of course. What else could she do? But he didn't respond. He just sat there, his face a mask of cold detachment, while she stumbled over her words, trying to justify the unjustifiable. The silence cut deeper than any confrontation could. The look in his eyes, betrayal, was more than she could bear. Then, without a word, he got up and left. Just like that. No shouting, no accusations, nothing. He walked out, leaving her with nothing but her guilt and the unbearable silence of an empty house. Days passed, and the silence became suffocating. She felt like a ghost haunting her own home, drifting from room to room, unsure of what to do next. There was no communication, no clue what he was planning. She was left to stew in her guilt, haunted by the memory of him watching that video, by the knowledge that she had destroyed everything. Then the messages started, not from the blackmailer this time, but from him. Her husband. Cryptic, unsettling messages that hinted at something more. He knew more than she thought, that much was clear. But how much? And what was he planning? His revenge didn't come all at once. It was subtle at first. He started inviting friends over, casual gatherings that seemed innocent enough on the surface. But there was an underlying tension that made her skin crawl. He made her the center of attention, forcing her into situations where she felt watched, exposed. This time, it wasn't about blackmail, it was about humiliation. He wanted her to feel it, to relive the shame in front of others. One night, during one of these gatherings, he made an offhand remark that sent chills down her spine. You know, she's always the life of the party. His tone dripped with something far darker than his words suggested. The room fell quiet, everyone exchanging glances while she sat there frozen, knowing full well what he was planning. And that's when she realized this was just the beginning.